All right.
Got it.
So we're now live. We have our friends over from the Xamarin team. They are not in the room, unfortunately, but we have Steven in the room, who is normally on the conf call. Steven, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Great. Can you see the screen? Awesome.
A little fuzzy.
So then, James, do you want to give us an overview of what Xamarin Essentials is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm James Montemagno. I'm a principal PM on our mobile dev tools. Over in Boston office, we have John Dick, who works heavily on this, along with, oh gosh, who else is in the room, John?
We've got a few other people on my team, the components Xamarin team. Matthew Leibowitz, who's done some work on Essentials. David Humphreys, who works on some other things. And Mel, who works on Android support and play services in Israel, who works on mostly iOS findings. But a good mix. Everyone's kind of familiar with Essentials and done a little bit of work here and there.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, so Xamarin Essentials is a new library for mobile.NET developers. Now, if anyone's not aware of Xamarin and the kind of perks and advantages that we have for mobile native development is that we offer 100% API surface for the underlying iOS and Android APIs in C#. So if you want to access location on iOS, you would access core location APIs. We create these bindings in C# and add C# features like async await, lambdas, events, and delegates. We do the same thing for Android. And of course, if you are writing UWP or other WPF applications, there's those .NET kind of equivalent SDK level APIs. So you just have all of this goodness. Now, at a high level, though, while it's amazing that we offer all of these APIs for developers, we find that a lot of our developers, majority of our developers, are writing a bulk, if not all of their application inside of a .NET Standard library, so all shared code. Because we have Xamarin Forms, which is shared native user interface, all in XAML. So when you're writing your models or your view models, you want to access these core underlying APIs of iOS, Android, and Windows from your shared code. So traditionally, what developers would have to do is they'd have to learn 3 different APIs. They would create an abstraction. They would have to go implement it 3 times over and over. So what Xamarin Essentials attempts to do is it abstracts all of the platform APIs into a single cross-platform .NET API for developers. So we attempted to look at what are the most important hardware features that developers are trying to get access to from their shared code and give them a consistent library and API that they can use. So a single NuGet library that they can pull in to their iOS, Android, or Windows projects. And the .NET standard is basically the API surface, and that's what we're looking at here. So we use kind of a bait and switch technique. So when a developer calls a method, it's still calling the underlying iOS or Android or Windows implementation, but they don't have to worry about it. It's one API. So this means for an API like Compass, which could be hundreds of lines of codes, it's 2 lines of code, right? Just start, stop, and add an event handler. So we aim to do that. And that's what Xamarin Essentials is. It's about 30 plus platform abstracted APIs.
So when you say bait and switch, you basically mean you have multiple builds of the same surface area targeting the different implementation, and based on what you deploy to, you get the relevant binary?
Yeah, that's correct. So we implement the same API across iOS, Android, and Windows. So when a developer adds a library, they must add it into their target platform. And then at runtime, it will choose it will favor the iOS DLL implementation over the .NET Standard version that just throws exceptions, basically. And this was very popularized in a lot of different libraries to do things like this, like our plugins and things like that. So we want to standardize everything into one library. And it's architected to be very user-friendly. So you'll notice that there's a lot of statics. There's no interfaces. Everything is trying to be consistent and lowest common denominator, but provide a lot of functionality.
Are you able to have 100% behavioral equivalent across all the platforms for the APIs you've chosen? Are there any cases where some of these work differently on different platforms?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we do an API spec, we take that into consideration for each and every single API. So a good example of how an API would differ, let's say the Compass API is a good one. On Windows and on iOS, there is a literal Compass API to get access to. Now, they offer different information between that, but we picked like heading magnetic north, for instance, as this is something that all of them represent and what developers would most want. Now, on Android, there is no Compass API. You actually have to spin up multiple sensors, do some math, combine them together. So we offer, we just hide that from the user. So the end result is expected. So that's there. Now, in our documentation, though, we do sometimes offer some functionality that's available in a single platform that maybe falls back to something graceful in the other ones. So a good example of that in our documentation would be if you were to open the Maps application. So this is our Maps API. So inside of the documentation, what we do is we reference if there's any setup, any permissions you need to set. And then specifically, we have a section called Platform Differences and Platform Implementation Specifics. So Platform Differences highlights anything that when you're calling a shared API is a little bit different. So for instance, on this opening maps, you can request to open bicycle, driving, walking, a default, or transit. But for instance, Android doesn't support transit. It does support bicycle, for instance. So developers can take that into consideration. We try to minimize that as much as humanly possible. So it's very rare that there is this case, but we do document it if it is there.
And what's the what's the typical fallback at runtime? So in that Android case, you request transit, you get an exception, or it falls back to walking or something?
Yeah, it would fall back to the default at that point. So there's a default that would be selected. So it would most likely, or what it would do, sorry, not most likely, what it would do is it would open the location and then have the user select their transportation mechanism. Instead of selecting one for them, the default is don't select any and just start navigation on it and let the user decide.
Got it.
And this is they're very rare cases, so it's not it's the exception to the rule, not the rule.
Okay. It seems sensible, honestly.
And we try to do things that that make the most sense. So for launching the map application on iOS and Android, there's a specific API to do that. On Android, there's not. You have to use the intent system, and you pass it a geo URL. So in this instance, we actually have no control over what will happen, like what map application will launch, but we document that. So we can only do what the API gives us. So we can't force Waze, or we could force Waze and we could force Google Maps, but that's really not what the platform is intended to do. So we don't do anything that's not normal for the core underlying iOS, Android, or Windows API. So we don't do hacks, basically, to make things happen.
There's also some cases where we have platform-specific APIs in the platform-specific assembly, and there's a few instances, like one somebody had requested with secure storage. On iOS, you can actually set the keychain data to be available like after the first time that you unlock the device, or it's available as soon as the device is booted. So we set a sensible default in that case, but if the user really wants to get down to the platform-specific implementation level and kind of override that default, in some cases we actually do compile that into the assembly as well.
So, yeah, and in those instances, those would be compiled into the iOS or Android-specific API level and would not be in the .NET Standard version, since it's specific to that platform, because this library could also be used not from a .NET Standard library at all. It could just be used from an iOS project, for instance. And then that would be a case where maybe they want a little bit more functionality. But I guess those are usually edge cases. And we look at those on an API basis.
And the reason they would use Xamarin Essentials over the iOS provided APIs is because yours are just much nicer and easier to use, or
And consistent across platform.
well, sure,
Yeah,
but if
so
they already are an iOS app, then they don't care, right? They're clearly running.
Well, they can kind of do a mix of it too, right? Like they might use from their net standard assembly, they might use the secure storage, the same API, in that shared library. But that they can also in their app project, their iOS app project, use that specific platform API that we make available to change like when that keychain data is unlocked. So you can kind of have a mix of both as well. You can kind of use that consistent API as much as you can, and there might be a place here and there that you do something platform specific as well.
Yeah, so
Yeah, and a good reason why someone may use this, for instance, if I'm doing like the accelerometer or compass, the iOS API is very elegant, to be honest with you. The Android one is like a hot mess, just as you can look at the code. So I would rather use our API. And for instance, secure storage, we wrote hundreds of lines of code to abstract it into a simple one-liner. So for me, based on the level of control that I need in my application, I always give this, for a long time, I've always said 80-20. So if you can use this API to appease 80% of the use cases, then that's really good. However, I think that Xamarin Essentials facilitates 95+% of the use cases of a single API. So it's a much more elegant and consistent API across that.
So the typical usage, you alternate two things. It's like apps using it directly, then you have .NET Standard projects using it directly. Do you have many usages in multi-targeted projects as well, or what's the other one called? The shared projects, which was the old multi-headed approach. Is this also something that you typically see people using your stuff in?
Yeah, I think our developers, our defaults are .NET Standard 2.0 when you create a new project. So I think that is our go-to. I don't have the usage specifics or could really talk to, but most of our developers that I talk to, and even myself, we default to .NET Standard there. I still think that there are some shared projects out there. And then in that instance, you would be falling back to the platform APIs that are in there. So you would run into maybe seeing an iOS-specific API in there, and you'd have to conditionally compile that.
Right.
But of course, your compiler would catch that when you can do Android. That's why we minimize those specific calls. As far as multi-targeting for apps would be low. I've always recommended multi-targeting only for library creators, not for app developers.
Right.
In general. Yeah. At the current stage, based on tooling.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's not very well supported in Xamarin iOS and Android apps.
Yep.
yeah. And on Visual Studio for Mac. So
Yeah.
Cool.
But you would expect most of your customers to be just the .NET Standard library, right?
that would be the 80-20.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So the only reason I'm asking is basically, so there's a few issues that we recently talked about. One of them was, so I don't know whether you saw them, but we just added reflection emit to .NET Standard. So we added a capability API with that. So you can actually check whether reflection emit will basically throw platform not supported. And we added another capability API that indicates how good it is supported. So like the Xamarin runtime people are working on the an IL interpreter. So if you're using reflection emit, for example, to speed things up, you probably don't want to use it if you know that the IL is actually ending up being interpreted, in which case whatever you're doing is probably faster than going through ref emit. And so we basically have two capability APIs that people use. But the key scenario there is, if you think from a library standpoint, having APIs that throw makes a lot more sense than not having the API, because if you're not having the API, you force everybody to effectively multi-target, right? And having the API and have that just not work is usually the better approach. But it seems like you're kind of going down the same path, because you're basically exposing concepts that may not work everywhere, but if they work in enough places, it's still worthwhile having, and then you just deal with the fallout if the API is not available to you.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah. So in this instance, in this .NET Standard, if we look at the secure storage, get, remove all set, those are implemented in every single platform that we support as of today. Now, if you don't install the NuGet into your iOS project, and you only put in your .NET Standard and you call get async, that will throw an exception. It's a custom exception that we have, which is not there, not implemented in reference assembly exception,
right,
which is a very long name, but describes exactly what it is, which is it's not implemented in a reference assembly. And that throws a helpful error telling you that you need to install it into your platform project. However, of course, there is no graceful way of detecting is secure storage implemented on the platform today. So if someone was to implement this in or install it into a Mac project, for instance, it would just throw a reference, or a WPF project, for instance, because it is .NET Standard, so it would install,
right,
but it would just throw an exception.
Yeah, I think you talked about this. I don't think you basically say you don't have, like, anything in Xamarin Essentials does not have a meaningful .NET Standard implementation, right? The only implementations you have are the UWP, iOS, and Android ones, right? So you would always throw from the .NET Standard one.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the one thing that we talked about is probably we want to add some notion of a capability API. The question is where to put them and like how that would look like. I think when you showed me the source code, you have an internal one currently, which I think is on the actual types, right? So you have like browser.is supported or parameter.is supported. And I think the question there is if that makes sense or if it doesn't make sense. I think from our general, like, I mean, to be fair, we don't have many capability APIs in the BCL today, because in the past we didn't care that much. We just made it work in all the places. But moving forward, I think we have to model this place more often. And the general idea is that we want to put the capability APIs as close to the feature as we can, because it helps people to understand that there is something to think about when they call the APIs. So I think having it on a barometer or whatever would make sense. Now, if in your case, basically, it always returns true unless you're in .NET Standard, in which case it always returns false, that might be a bit of busy work, but you set yourself up a bit more for success. And I think we talked about having a desktop implementation, right? Because you currently only have UWP implementation. So moving forward, if you want to also support, let's say, .NET Framework apps or regular desktop apps with .NET Core 3.0, you might want to extend some of the features, and then maybe some things are just not available because they don't exist in a desktop computer. Like, I don't know, some of the accelerometer data might not be available when you're running in a regular PC, right? While the other ones might be available, like secure storage or the browser or battery information, and so on and so forth. And the other thing that we talked about was the notion of is supported or has implementation, as you call it, and it actually is available to you. Like, as in, you might have a Compass, but your app might lack the permission to actually access it. So then the question is, how do we model this in the capability API? Do we have two of them? And if so, like, what would the name be? And then also, what is the expectation for the customer? Like, if it's a property and the check for seeing whether you have the permission is super expensive, then maybe properties don't make much sense, right? I think those are the two things we may want to talk about. And then I think the last thing that we talked about was namespaces, right? Like whether you want to put this in Xamarin Essentials or not, which we can maybe push a little bit to the end.
So with the capability stuff, I think, one of the other layers that we get into with that is, yes, first it's permissions and whether or not we have permission to access it.
Right.
And then also, does the device actually support that capability? But that's kind of got two parts to it as well. Like, one of them does the device have a camera? And if it does, is the policy for that device set to allow the camera to be used? So, it's not only does the capability exist, but is it disabled? Is it turned off? Is the GPS turned off? So there's a few different layers to that question in itself.
Does the developer care if the device does not have a GPS versus the device has a GPS, but the user has said no one shall access it, period?
One of them is you tell them this feature doesn't work because you turned off GPS, and the other is you don't tell them because there's no GPS. So,
yeah.
Well, and that's the other thing is, like, some apps have, some platforms have the ability to prompt the user to ask for permissions.
I realize.
In which case you might actually write different code
on a per app basis. I meant, like, as a matter of policy, if your entire device is just disabled the GPS system wide, like, do we care about exposing that distinction versus you don't have a GPS?
Well, that's what I'm saying, right? Like if you expect writing code, like if you have a GPS but I don't have permission, prompt the user for giving me permissions.
Yes.
It makes no sense to do that if the device doesn't have a GPS.
Or if, as a matter of policy, GPS is disabled device-wide.
Well, I would argue you can
However,
you can model this in one of the two
It'll
cases.
manifest that to the app some way.
Right.
I mean, I slightly noticed just because it's on Emo's screen here that you have a thing called battery, and it very much looks like you're assuming that a device only ever has one.
Yeah.
That certainly can be not true for PCs, and depending on how different phones model having extension packs attached, that wouldn't be true for a phone either.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So like I suggest like let's cover the capability APIs maybe generally, and then just walk the APIs.
Okay.
And then I think namespaces we can maybe cover later. So I think the question really is like, what is the model to do that? I think the general idea of capability APIs is you want to expose what you expect customers to actually write code for, right? So if there's no point in writing an if statement, then exposing that as a capability API may not make a lot of sense. I think generally speaking, the notion of if you have, for example, like I think in Windows 8 they had the same example with the printer API, right? So imagine you have a printer API and you want to make sure that you work in data centers where there is no printer, right? One way to model this is to have a property that says, has support for printer or something. Another one is to just have an API surface that kind of implies, similar to the battery examples, like, oh, you may have multiple of those, and one correct answer is you have none of those, right? In which case you have an API that says get printers, and giving an empty array back is a completely valid implementation, in which case the API shape itself has a very graceful, if you don't have a printer, like what would the return radius look like kind of experience, where you don't have to throw, right? Which might be, for the camera, the same thing. If you have more than one camera, well, if you have a list of cameras that you can ask for, well, then maybe have no cameras is also a valid return value, right? In which case you may not actually have to model the fact that, we have an implementation for the platform versus this device or this particular device doesn't actually have a camera. That might be a not useful distinction anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think in a bunch of cases it does. For something like, GPS, I think there might be a user desire to be able to kind of differentiate between there is no GPS and it's disabled, and like you had talked about, being able to enable it or guide them on some platforms to enable it.
Yeah, I think that GPS of all of our APIs is the most complex API, especially around Android. And this is a very unique scenario on Android. So Android has the concept of providers, so like a Wi-Fi provider, a passive provider, a database provider, an actual GPS provider. So what we do is based on the parameters that the user gives us, the developer gives us, we figure out the best provider to use. Now, what's very intriguing here is that if there's no providers, then that means that it's disabled. However, you cannot get a list of providers until the user gives you permission to actually access GPS. So you're in this weird catch where you can't even detect if there is a GPS until you request permission. So when a user today requests geolocation from us, so there's no API on geolocation to say, do I have GPS? Is it enabled? Like, is it available? Is it enabled? We had old libraries that did this, and you got this weird mashup. Do you have to asynchify everything? Do you have to handle permissions? Do you let the user handle permissions? Do you handle permissions? So in this instance, our workflow is pretty simple. When someone requests location, we check to see if they have permission. If they don't, we prompt for permission. If that fails, we throw an exception. Then, if we do get permission, we check to see if geolocation is enabled. So are there any providers that fit our requirements? And if there's not, then we throw an exception. So it's very exception-based. And then we actually try to get the location, and that either passes or fails. So there's multiple tiers there. So even in that instance, which is an edge case, right, but something to think about, which is it's impossible to know if there is even geolocation enabled until permission is given. So is that a API concern? Is that a documentation concern? Where does that fall? And that's a weird case. So for this API as of today, we didn't introduce any of those, and we went with this exception-based route.
But taking that one, it sounds effectively like Android can be modeled as having, I'll go with rough counting, 6 different GPS devices. And if you had an enumerate API, well, that would clearly have to ask for permission because you've called it. And then now, if they give you the no, you return the empty set. And if they say yes, you can give them all 6. And if you have Accelerator API that handles common cases but doesn't cut someone off from, like, you said that you're guessing on their behalf essentially. So like, if all of these APIs were just built to handle multiple/0, then that would just be a natural flow.
Yeah, if it makes sense, right? I think for some things it might not make sense, right? Having multiple thermometers doesn't seem to be sensible, right? You would just say, well, you either have one or you don't have one.
I mean, it's a question of what level of future scale, like you mentioned, desktop. Desktop, you can plug in unlimited USB devices, right? Or USB may have some limit somewhere.
Right.
If we start looking at, taking an API like this and putting it with, the Arduinos and any of those things, how many different sensors did you hook up that will report as being one of these things? Like, if you think of it just as a phone, yeah, there's probably only ever going to be one temperature sensor in it. But what is the API really that scoped, or does it make sense to be generally applicable to mobile devices? Well, maybe the mobile device itself has multiple different sensors. One inside, one outside, one as a probe that you stick in your oven. So,
at the same time, the complexity of adding support into the API for any number of barometers and any number of batteries probably complicates the 99.9% case that most people are using this API for. And so I could imagine saying, go with this, and then in the future when it becomes an issue, you have a barometers class that allows you to get an instance barometer or whatever. And yeah, maybe it makes the API less nice at that point, but...
Well, I mean, yeah, the problem at that point is barometers, which lets you enumerate, can't give you a barometer because all of the good names were taken as stats.
Hey, side-by-side releases, awesome. We can make breaking changes.
So I'm just...
I'm saying there are other... to me, that seems like less of an issue than complicating the API now and making it harder for the 99.9% case.
That's fair. I'm bringing...
No, it's a valid point. It's a valid point.
That's a valid point. I think it's something I didn't necessarily think of, because usually you're right. Usually on a mobile device, there's only ever going to be one battery, or the API will combine it together in that instance. But yeah, you're correct. You could maybe throw in 20 barometers, and then yeah, the idea is then are you subscribing to that specific barometer, and how would you abstract to this generic barometer to understand it at an iOS or Android level? In general, when there is, like, on those platforms, there's always a singleton. So I guess you would always pass back the same class barometer. So instead of barometer being a start-stop, it's actually a physical class that represents a physical device, right? I look at this as this is an API that's exposing events, but in kind of what you're saying is, we think of the API as returning like an instance of the device and the capabilities of that device, then it's a different way of looking at that specific API.
I have a somewhat related question, but also not exactly. So I understand the ease of use of the static APIs, start-stop, but I'm wondering how that works when you've got maybe multiple libraries in your application that are all communicating. For example, multiple libraries hook up a reading changed event. They individually call start and stop, but then after they've called stop, they're maybe still getting events because someone else started it again?
Yeah, it's completely possible.
It seems very unexpected.
Yeah. Yeah, so in an instance, let's say you call start, and then if you call start again, it'll already know that it's monitoring, so it won't start and trigger new events.
Sure.
When anybody calls stop, since it is static, it will stop any readings that are subscribed.
And if you called stop and didn't expect to get any more events, and then someone else called start, you might get events that you weren't in any way expecting.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
So I think that's something we should probably talk about. So the guidance that I think the Xamarin Essentials team has received is that they, as James said, the typical thing that people have done in the past is that they have an I sensor and then an iOS sensor and an an iOS sensor and an Android sensor as implementing those interfaces, and then you have like dependency injection to get the implementation, right? And they said basically, screw that, we just go with bait and switch to make it super, super simple. And then the next step was, well, can we make everything static? So it's super, super, super simple. I think in general that pattern works, but when I looked over the APIs with James, I said similar things. There are some APIs here that seem to maintain state. And the general guidelines that we have is that when you have a static type, or when you have static members, they are supposed to be thread safe. So meaning you need to be able to have a policy what happens when multiple people on different threads calling the same static methods, right? And I think some APIs that you have, like start stop or having a global event handler, is kind of asking for trouble in the sense that you basically now subscribing, on your end to handle the essential threading issues. If we just make this a class that you can just instantiate, well then, your policy can sensibly be, I only support one thread. If you want multiple threads, well then use multiple instances of this type, right? And then it's very clear that, well, if you subscribe to events on this type, well, you only receive them on this type and not some other instance that somebody else subscribed to. That might actually make your implementation less buggy, but it means that some of the types that are currently static may not be static moving forward. But I think from a usability standpoint, I think having a type you can just new up is not horrible. Like, that's still pretty straightforward.
What about things like sensor speed? Like, what happens if two different threads call start with two different speeds?
Well, I mean, I would say the underlying API on iOS and Android clearly has to have a policy when multiple apps are running and different people do different things with that, right? Like, whatever that capability is.
I mean, I'm not
sure.
sure.
Yeah, so I can tell you exactly how this would work. So at least in the world of Android, for instance, let's say you start up an accelerometer, you would get access to that sensor and you could say sensor speed fastest and you start listening. Now, if you create another instance and get that sensor and start another listener at a slower speed, that slower speed will take preference over the last call. So both of your readings, so you apply listeners, which are basically event handlers, and those listeners, the first one would then be throttled when you apply the second one, and you have to roll them back in succession to unsubscribe from those listeners to stop the readings. So there is a certain a part of complexity there that is occurring. So for instance,
so just to ask, everything you just described, that's policy at the Android level, or that's policy at your library level?
So that's at the Android level. So our policy as of today is that if you start the barometer at the fastest level and you hit start again, nothing will change because you have to call stop first, because it already is monitoring. So if you want to change your sensor speed, you have to stop and then start again.
As part of is monitoring, are you also capable of detecting the speed and having that be reported via property?
We could, yes. We capture it, yes.
Is it ref counted? Because otherwise it seems like two libraries start, hook up an event, start, get what they need, stop, and one of them would stop it for the other person.
Yeah, that would be the thread safe part of it, so that's not handled.
Is that something that actually ever happens in practice in mobile applications?
You get a library that uses the barometer?
I mean, does that tend to happen at a library level or at the application level for the most part?
I don't know. I would assume there'd be libraries that interact with the libraries, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, but I would assume it's uncommon for an application to pull in multiple such libraries simultaneously.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think if you're going to be pulling in a library that helps you work with the barometer, you're probably not going to be accessing it through Essentials as well.
Right.
Even if that other library accesses it through Essentials.
So even though these are net standard APIs, you expect they're not being consumed by other net standard libraries, you expect they're being consumed by the applications?
I think they could be both. I'm just saying, like, if I install library B that depends on Essentials that interacts with the barometer, I'm probably using library B to access the barometer data, and it's going to be the only one accessing the barometer API from Essentials. I'm probably not going to also register my own listener directly through Essentials because I'm already doing it through this other library.
I mean, I think that there may be a use case. Let's say you bring in a 3D game engine that happens to use Xamarin Essentials, and it's using our orientation sensor to orient things in the real space. And then you, developer, come in and you say, oh, I also want to use the orientation sensor here, and I want to do something else in the background for some reason. So you start. Now, on an Android level, on a platform level, let's say you're doing this just in Java or Kotlin, you would have the same issue. You could create some other third-party library that may be brought in that's messing around with the sensors. Now, it wouldn't stop yours, though. That's the difference. I think on Android, if you're in pure Kotlin world, you may be interacting with the sensors, and perhaps your sensor speed changes because another library is changing and subscribing. The difference here is that if that third-party library with Xamarin Essentials is using that orientation sensor and they call stop, then your events would also be stopping, right? So it's like you don't have a unique instance of that orientation sensor there. So that is it. I think that's probably an edge case, but I think that could happen possibly for some of these.
The other problem with the static event is, Steve mentioned that you've called stop and now you're surprised when you get more events because someone else called start. There's not actually a correct time for you to register your event handler, because if you register an event handler pointing at an instance, you might not have finished configuring it, but somebody else has already called start, and now you start getting events before you called start, so you didn't think the sensor should have been active at all.
Yeah.
So definitely the ones with events, there's definitely a threading concern.
From a threading perspective as well, where are these events raised? Well, like wherever you get a callback from the OS, that's where it's invoked in the event?
No, not necessarily. So for these events, it's based on the sensor speed. So if you invoke it, and so the sensor speed itself has four settings, excuse me. So if I look at a sensor, there are fastest, game, normal, and UI. And normal and UI are guaranteed to be returned on the UI thread, and game and fastest are not guaranteed to be on the UI thread.
Okay. Are those polling from your library, or those like IO completion threads?
It's callbacks from the native platform, depending however they implement it.
Fair enough.
Yeah, we have a main thread class, and the main thread helps you detect if you're on the main user interface thread, and also begin invoking on the UI thread. That's fair.
Okay.
Yeah, the other problem that you have with static event handlers is that because they point back to the object instance, you have to be very careful that you don't keep your objects around forever, basically. So typical example here is you have a view model somewhere that subscribes to, let's say, the barometer event. Well, if this guy never unsubscribes, then this view model will now stick around for all eternity of the app. So like basically people have to be very careful that they unsubscribe from these guys, or bad things will happen. And if you look around in UI code, people unfortunately rarely unsubscribe from anything, and then they find out the hard way that they kept what they thought short-lived objects for, around for a very long time. So that's why people often ask for weak event handlers, and I'm not sure, we talked about this a few times. I don't think we have a very good story internally to deal with that right now. You can probably do some crazy gymnastics with weak objects, also with weak references yourself, but I doubt that it will work really well for you, because you will at least leak the underlying element in the linked list you have. But it's probably better than leaking the entire object reference. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a GC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're basically fighting the GC. So I don't know, like, what does the architecture in Xamarin Forms look like? Do you have view models that are disposable? Is there, like, do people have an easy way to unsubscribe? Like, can they subscribe to a closed event or whatever of the screen or something? Because that's usually the problem that you have. There's no convenient way to register those.
Yeah, I mean, usually, like on Xamarin Forms has, I can't think of the events offhand, but there is a page closing event maybe. Appearing and disappearing, yeah. So typically, especially anything UI related, on the disappearing event, you would unregister your handlers and clean up there.
I see. So as long as people
But
are aware of that.
in practice, I think you're right. Many people don't do that regardless.
Yeah, again, looking at the barometer specifically and thinking about threading, I'm also curious of if one library sets up a handler called start, and another library sets up a handler and calls start, and let's assume we're in a sealed room so the pressure doesn't actually change. The second library never gets its initial reading, or I presume because the reading never changed. Unless reading changed isn't actually changed, it's reading provided. But in which case there's a different problem.
Yeah, correct. I mean, there are so it's for sensors, it is reading provided. For certain things, it is actually changed. So, for instance, a battery, we guarantee that all the properties, at least one of them, has changed inside of it. Accelerometer, we don't. We provide just a reading triggered in general, and the underlying systems from our findings are only when they actually change. So if it's sitting still, it doesn't trigger it, but that's not necessarily guaranteed. But the underlying platform basically guarantees that. But I do think that you may run into that scenario that you described. I think any of these scenarios of start, stop from multiple callers could run into this scenario. That's correct.
Is there the concept in these devices of polling? Like, can I walk up to the barometer on iOS and say, what is the current reading?
On some of them, yes. On others, no. So on Android, for instance, no, you cannot. You have to apply a listener, and then the moment that you apply a listener, you will get an immediate call that will tell you. On iOS, for instance, you can just say, give that to me. The iOS APIs are very beautiful. Apple did a great job. But for most of them, I would say, not all of them. There are definitely not some non-beautiful APIs too. But in general, you can say, give me this reading for the barometer, for instance, and it'll return it to you. But since all platforms don't do that, we don't expose that property.
Yeah, because, on platforms that don't, you could theoretically just do a subscribe, ask for this, and, depending on if they let you know that they're already running, and so you don't have to configure polling speeds and whatnot. But
right,
like theoretically, that could be, you can provide the polling API on platforms that don't have it, if you want it. Yeah. So I do then have objection to the verb changed if change is not implied in the callback.
Yeah.
And I think we could guarantee that. I think it would make sense to only be changed if it's changed. Hold on, I'll be right back. I got someone at the door.
I'm also looking at like the accelerometer stuff like that on iOS, and they, as was mentioned earlier, they use singletons for everything. So it's completely unexpected that you might have two different libraries within a single application, both independently trying to use the accelerometer. Like Apple's documentation clearly calls out, do not do that.
You're holding it wrong?
No, it's like it's a singleton object, right? If one person calls stop on a singleton, it's going to affect everyone listening to it.
Right. I mean, it kind of makes sense in the sense that, well, there is hardware, right? And there really only is one of them, so you can only do so much.
I'm just, wondering what it means for the API.
Yeah. And I should say it's a per application basis, right?
Right.
Like if app A calls stop, app B is still going to get data.
Right.
So.
But I think the interesting thing with that too is that, like, if you even if we kind of build that protection into Essentials itself, it doesn't stop some other library from stopping or changing the sensor speed on us, in that application and still affecting Essentials the same way.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, if we think that simply the being in a Xamarin-based namespace implies phone level device and not a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino or anything like that, then maybe some of these assumptions make sense. I'm just raising the issue so that they're thought about.
Yeah, I think in general we had, the other week we did the review of the GPIO stuff, right? And Jan raised the point there that maybe the API will not last super long, given that this market is evolving very quickly. So we may find ourselves having to rewrite the APIs anyway.
Yeah.
So in that sense, given how mobile works, I would say the same applies probably here. We can try really hard to make it, a good API, but I think similar to ASP.NET, where sometimes you just have to have making changes because the ecosystem has just changed, it seems reasonable too. So I would generally say, like, the goal of the library clearly is to make the user's life easier and drive convergence between the platforms from our point of view. So I would say that in general, future-proofing APIs is a good thing, but it does conflict with the let's have a simple API, right? And so we should probably focus on that. At the expense that maybe in a year from now or 2 years from now we find ourselves wanting to change the API surface. But usually you can make the things additive by just having a new type name and obsolete the other one.
I mean, if you think that it'll be degenerative over time, then it means maybe you take the second best name for your namespace right now, so that you leave the better name for later. But
so regarding a lot of these types have units on them, like acceleration, barometer, stuff like that. Are we normalizing those between operating systems?
Interesting.
So like I was looking at Apple's documentation, acceleration on all 3 axes is listed as Gs. I don't know if it's just straight up meters per second squared on other platforms. Like I don't know.
Yeah, so we normalize every single one of these, and we document what they are, for instance. And there are some instances we tend to normalize towards the Windows API, to be honest with you, the UWP API, because it's the more .NET-y API of them. So, for instance, if it is meters per second squared, then we will normalize on that. Yeah, that's a key objective too, I would say. And instead of learning 3 APIs that give you 3 different results, that no matter what is coming from us is a normalized result for the accelerometer, for instance. And then we will document that they are reported back in Gs, and we even will tell you that exactly what that means, that it's a gravitational force, blah blah blah, 9.8, blah blah blah,
right.
Accelerate. So we do that.
Emo, do we tend to specify units in things like property names, or is that mainly a doc concern?
Well, we generally try to avoid it if we can, right? I mean, we have got a bunch of types that have like time span, right, rather than, in milliseconds, right?
Yeah.
But we have pushed back on APIs where somebody had an in time, and it's like, okay, great, which unit do you take, right? Like, time seems to be very ambiguous. So, like, if there is a type, I would prefer the type. If there is no type, at least make it clear what the metrics are. But for things like, I don't know, how would you name the accelerometer result? Like, value G? Like, I mean, how do you...
G-force?
Well, so you get back a vector 3. It's a vector of 3 floats. Acceleration, right?
Yeah, in the beginning of this API too, we were returning an X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And what we decided was that vector 3 itself provides, this is from our documentation team, provided feedback when they were using the API that if we were to use a vector 3, especially for the orientation sensor, that provides a lot of helper functions to actually iterate on it. So we take a dependency on the system numeric vector package inside of here. But I mean, it's implemented on every single system besides the standard one, which we do have a shim compatibility for, just for the sake of doing it. So so we do bring that in. So that's why it's a vector 3, compared to previously it was acceleration X, acceleration Y, acceleration Z, or XYZ just in general, which we thought was not great. But that's what our thought there.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, maybe we should just walk the APIs top to bottom now that we actually talked about the generics quite a bit. No pun intended there. All right, so let's start with this. So we have is monitoring, which I guess means at least somebody was calling start at some point.
That's correct.
and then you have the event, and then so start and stop is not ref counted, right? So last one wins, right?
Last one wins.
And start UI followed by start fastest is UI or fastest?
There's a fastest, game, normal,
Well,
UI.
I mean, what? So can you change the start speed or the sensor speed without calling stop? And
No.
Can you pull the speed?
No, it's not available.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's to change the sensor speed, you would on some platforms you would have to stop anyways. So on Android, for instance, to do it properly, you'd have to unsubscribe a listener and resubscribe a listener. Of course, we could do that for you under the hood, so it wouldn't really matter. But I don't know if we document this use case of calling start twice and what would happen.
Yeah.
We mostly document call is monitoring first and then start, else stop, type of thing. But
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether maybe start should throw if you're already monitoring.
Presumably
From the library state
not-
or from the hardware state?
No, from like the implementation of accelerometer that we have here. Like
Yeah.
if you call start and it's monitoring returns true, you just throw and say, I'm already running, what are you doing?
Did we decide that having two different components calling into the accelerometer was a compelling story?
If it's static, it's dangerous. So having start throw would be better.
Because the reason I'm saying that is because if you ever hit this case, at least you know, oh, maybe I should check its monitoring before, and then maybe you start thinking about your own logic. Well, what happens if it's true? Like, what am I supposed to do with that information, right?
It means there's probably an error somewhere in your code.
Yeah.
Well, also like how you register the event, like when you do that, like, oh, now I can receive events even though I'm not ready yet. Like, I think this is some gains you have from that.
Okay.
And I'll restate the feedback on this one, and it applies to all of them. To me, if the verb on the event is changed, I should not get equivalent data in two successive readings.
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree.
And if that's the case, then that's fine. And if it's simply that you're getting periodic updates, then maybe change is not the right verb.
I think that I think it should be changed because that's when you would want to actually get those rating changes. And since every single one of our data structures implements equatable, we should be able to guarantee that. So I think it's just to make sure that if we are calling it reading change, which we believe what it is, then we should guarantee that it's only when the reading changes. And I think that makes valid sense.
Right.
Is change, like, do you consider two numbers that differ by 0.000001 to be changed?
Yes.
Okay.
The OS gave you a different answer. Maybe someone needs to know that they're slowing down.
Well, the OS is pulling, right? Like
The OS is pushing.
pushing, yes, but it's doing it periodically. The OS doesn't have a concept of this data has changed. Accelerometer data, do you not expect anybody to ever instantiate that class or that struct aside from you?
As of today, no.
Because the only constructor
we made it
on it is
internal.
parameterless.
Sorry, go ahead, sorry.
Well, the only constructor on it is parameterless, that's why.
Yes, and I believe let me look at the data type and our shared code. Yeah, all of our constructors are internal. So we have accelerometer data that takes in doubles and floats, and then we normalize correctly based on that to create the vector 3.
Does that make
those
testing
are
really
internal.
difficult?
Well, is vector mutable?
Vector is, I don't
believe
think
it's mutable, yeah.
Well, if it's
think it
mutable,
is?
then the default value is mutable. So
This is the cores vector 3, or this is the framework vector 3?
Yeah,
or-
it's just
Yes, vector 3 is mutable.
yeah. So you say accelerometer data foo
yeah.
equal default. Foo.acceleration.x.
No, that won't work because the acceleration property makes a copy of the field, because vector 3 itself is a struct.
Fair enough. So you get to write code that looks like it does something, and then you get the
And then it
fun,
breaks, yeah.
You did assignment through a struct field or struct property, and why did the CPU slow down even though nothing happened?
Yes.
Well, I don't think you don't even get to do the assignment. I think the compiler, but if you say acceleration dot x equals blah, I think the compiler will actually give you an error and say you can't do that.
Yeah, acceleration should probably be a read-only field instead of a property.
Why would that be better?
Why?
Because the struct itself is mutable, which means that if someone says my accelerometer data dot acceleration dot x plus plus, it will look like it works, but nothing will end up happening.
Are you sure? I think the
No,
compiler
the
actually.
compiler.
I think they get a compiler error.
Is it
I'm
now?
sure. I'm pretty sure they always got a
Okay.
compiler error.
I can test it really quick.
Yeah.
But read only field wouldn't buy you much because really somebody has to set it. Oh, I guess you can.
The
it's
internal constructor
sorry,
would.
It's the
Yeah.
never mind. Yeah. Anyway, so it's a bit unusual to have events of private constructors. I will give you that, but I don't think it matters because I think unit testing this library is hard already.
Okay.
I assume Levi's saying that he's writing his application code. He wants to fire different acceleration events at it and make sure that it's going to do what he wants. So not unit testing this library, unit testing the person who wants to consume this library.
Yeah, I think that's a sensible boundary to say. It would be nice if we could at least construct the event arc so you can at least simulate the receiver of that. The problem is though that depending on how you write the code, it might just be the first thing you do, and then the second thing is you actually subscribe to the static classes, and then you're screwed, right? You would have to at least split that apart.
Indeed.
But yeah, I think the general talk that I had with James was the idea is that you abstract it yourself if you want to make it unit testable.
Yeah, like you would just pass the acceleration instead of so you would unwrap the acceleration from the data. What does
So in this instance, we would open up the constructors for both the event arcs and the accelerometer data.
Yeah, I mean, structs always have a constructor anyway, but that's not the one you want. So you probably want to make the other one public as well, yeah.
or at least one that takes a vector 3.
Yeah.
I see. Oh, I see. Okay.
What does appinfo.open settings do?
I was about to ask that. Is it pop
Yeah.
UI?
It opens the user interface to the settings of your application.
That doesn't feel very info like the rest of the things.
It's kind of like, on some certain platforms, like on Android especially too, it is kind of where you go to see info about the app as well, like to see how much storage it's using up to clear the cache and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that one may be in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I'm wondering if maybe settings is not the right word. Does that I don't remember offhand. Does that take us to the actual app setting page in Android, for example, in iOS?
Yeah, so that will take us specifically to the application, the overall settings page for your application.
Yeah, which is kind of in the realm of info. Maybe the name is not.
Right, because
Yeah, so,
everything else is you're reading data about your app, and that one is in the phone, please send me to settings.app/application/my app. Like, it feels like a very different action than reading the build number.
Let's see. Yeah, so iOS calls this open settings URL string. So you give it a URL and you open the URL specifically, and it's called open settings URL string. And UWP calls this, it's a hard-coded string that's ms-settings : apps features -app, which is obviously very intuitive. Android is very generic, so you give it package and your name, and you open up the action application details settings. So that's the action. So settings is in all three of them in the name of the underlying platform, but I would agree that it is very different from reading information.
Yeah. that one, I don't know what I would call the class that would have that, but it feels different than the rest of the stuff in app info.
Does that one API warrant its own class then?
Well, whether it warrants its own class, I wouldn't go that far. I would just, I don't know, if you have a different type that might be more suitable for UI, maybe use that one instead. If you don't have them, then I would probably not introduce a new type just for one method.
Are there other places where you open UI that navigates to something? Like maybe it shouldn't be with settings specifically. Maybe there's a generic grab bag if I want to open this or open that.
Do we have a generic open settings in like the device info? I can't recall offhand. And maybe we could group a couple of those together into a different class if so.
Yeah,
I know we had talked about having that.
I was thinking something like, device interaction, but then it's like, but if you're trying to open your app settings, that's different than saying just go pop like settings.app and, but then maybe that would be open app device.open app settings or,
And maybe this is the right place for it, but maybe poke around and see if there's something better.
So that's just consider.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is like open settings doesn't imply to me UI is shown. Like give it a name that implies that. I mean, show settings comes to mind, or like open settings UI or something where it's because open to me also could just mean, I don't know, read the settings so I can.
That's
I
what
can
I initially thought it was, and then I saw it was void. I'm like, oh, maybe I have to call this before I access build string.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I was having the same thing. So it's, so if it stays here, then show seems a better verb than open.
Or even like navigate to settings UI or something.
Yeah, that also works. Yeah.
Open settings UI, in fact, suggests there's UI involved.
So I do like the consistency between accelerometer and barometer. That seems pretty sweet.
Yeah, all of our sensors implement the same exact is monitoring, start, stop. It makes it very easy to implement.
Right. So with pressure, I mean, I assume that based on your previous thing that you're normalizing it, but it's now we get the U.S. people expect it's PSI, Europeans expect it's pascals.
Millimeters of mercury.
Whatever the yes. So pilots want millimeters of mercury. Non-pilot U.S. citizens want PSI. Somebody in Europe wants whatever 1033 is.
Yeah.
I think they want bar. I think.
Oh yeah, that might be bar or millibar.
It's like the atmospheric pressure.
Yeah. Somebody wants pascals, so this one might need a unit on the name.
Are most of the devices consistent in what units they use for things like this?
Usually not. No.
Yeah.
So we return kilopascals. Usually we take what is the common between them. So what is the, what do most of them provide at that level? So Android and UWP, for instance, provide kilopascals, and we return that information back, basically.
So if I were proposing this API, I would name it pressure KPA, and then people would argue about that name. But so that's my off-the-cuff suggestion.
Yeah.
And you will put it in system security cryptography.
Well, that's because everything that I do is in system.
You would create a pressure type, and there will be lots of properties off of it. That is, what unit do you want this in?
Yeah. Maybe you want it in time of you have to be done by Thanksgiving.
Yes.
All right. So I think the unit one we have covered.
But yeah.
For the most part, this all looks like what you would expect. I mean, it's easy, consistent.
The battery is kind
Almost
of interesting because
API.
of the flip side to what Jeremy mentioned earlier. Like Jeremy mentioned, there are scenarios like this laptop, for instance, has 2 batteries in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there might actually be scenarios where you have no batteries. Imagine you're on a kiosk, right? It's not that difficult to imagine that there might be an iOS or Android device.
Well, that would be this, right? You would be connected to power, right?
Yeah, but what does charge level return?
Well, whatever it does when you're plugged in, right?
100%?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. That works.
Or 0. Nan. It's a double.
Okay, charge level returns 1.
I mean, Nan for there is no battery, actually.
Is charge level between 0 and 1, by the way?
Charge level is a double between 0 and 1.
Okay.
And if there is no battery, I have to look at the code. I don't know if it's
You can't
documented.
access the code because you're not running.
Well, so on Android and iOS, like you're always going to have a battery with current devices on the market, but it's not that hard to imagine that, someone will release a lower cost device that's just for kiosk scenarios that is required to be plugged in because there's no internal battery.
And I will just bring this up just one more time. I know that for at least iOS devices, you can buy external battery packs.
Yeah.
I don't know if the OS reports that as two separate batteries or merges them into one, or isn't even aware that it's there. But that's just a thing to consider.
Yeah. USB-C.
Yeah, so in this instance, we do have a battery state, which is not present, which means that there is no battery. So Windows specifically exposes that. And in that instance, if there is no battery at all, we report a -1 for the charge level, because if the system itself is telling us that there's no battery and cannot report a valid charge level, we return -1.
Interesting.
That seems strange.
I mean, the question is, how will people use charge level, right? That's why I would probably return 1.0, because probably want to have like a policy like, oh, I give a user a warning that the battery level is below some threshold, right? And if you always return 1.0, it works. If you do -1, you get these weird apps that start and say, sorry, consider plugging in because you have -1.0 battery left, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
at the same time, again, while NaN is normally not a number that gets used much, this literally is there is no number I can tell you that answers this. So NaN might actually be a reasonable answer. But
I mean, if you want to get technical, like, yes, that's probably the right thing to do, but just considering how people are likely to use this API,
Yeah.
like, why would someone want to call charge level?
You may want to call charge level to understand if you're doing advanced animations or doing something intense on the battery. For instance, let's say I want to call geolocation, and I notice that my battery is under 5%. I may want to get a very just last known instead of querying the GPS location in general. That's like one.
So I think from the two examples then that we've heard, in both cases, if you're plugged in, you want to assume that you have enough power to do whatever it is that you need to do, like not warn the user or to actually use GPS. So yeah, I think charge level 1 sounds quite reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah, a good example is, by the way, is my desktop computer doesn't have a battery. I mean, it has a power supply, but it doesn't have a battery, right? So in that instance, it has a power supply. So what's the charge level? Is it 1? I guess it has power. So
Emo, presumably your comment is when there is no battery, because technically if it's plugged in, it's also wired.
Fair enough.
Just like we shouldn't say, oh, it's charging, battery 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously external battery supplies like an Anchor, power supply. That's the same as charging it with AC. You know what I mean? That's no day. Like the device doesn't know that it is a battery. There's no USB. Chat.
And honestly, if we want to, like you said, if we want to expand this to multi-battery devices, just like average them or something. That's what the OS does.
Yeah, I'm just
it's a good fallback.
And I would say that the current API today handles that. It combines them into one. So, for instance, on UWP, where there could be multiple batteries, we iterate and get the aggregated battery of all batteries connected.
Yep.
So, what do you report if somehow one's charging and one's discharging? Like, because they're doing the memory phase cycle thing.
Whatever Windows tells us.
Oh, so not you aggregate it, you ask Windows for the aggregate state.
Windows itself has an API to aggregate batteries.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Because that actually can
that's
happen.
what we use.
Batteries.
And on Android, I believe Android is the same, to be honest with you. iOS only has one battery ever. So Android, I believe, is the same. I'd have to double check on it. But their APIs literally just give me the battery information, and it's probably whatever is displayed to the user in the top right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Makes sense. What do people do with unknown? Like, unknown is you don't have permission, or, I mean, how can it be unknown?
It means that the OS gave something that wasn't previously documented.
That is an accurate statement. Usually on Android, because every single battery, every single device manufacturer, technically these are not enums, these are just integers coming from Java. So we map them. However, like it's kind of impossible for us to know if sometimes if someone reports something that's not in the official documentation.
Anytime that you're wrapping a system thing, you should have an unknown value in your enum to say, like, the system told me something I don't know.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, browser. So the only question I have here is, why is that async? That seems counterintuitive. What is it that you're awaiting here?
So on browser, we have to await on UWP's launcher as an asynchronous API.
When does it go to completed?
When it's done.
When it's done.
When the
you
browser
close?
closes, or once it's open, like when it's launched. What do I do after the task completes?
Nothing.
So why is it?
I think it's when it's launched.
So
when it's launched.
What's the difference between this and open settings, which would turn void?
So open settings, the API. That's a good question.
Yeah.
So open settings, so it is an asynchronous API, but we wrap it in our own watch for error that gobbles up stuff.
So in either the opening settings UI case or opening the browser, is there an event raised to the application of they've hit the done button and are back in the app? Like, how does the app know when to continue? Or does it just keep running?
It just keeps running. There's no...
Yeah, and you'd see lifecycle events like, your page would appear again when you come back to your page from the browser.
So the main purpose of the task is to communicate if the operation to open the browser failed?
Yeah, I don't know what, I'm not sure what the expectation is if it fails, if you see an exception at that point. Just that we're seeing, like in the platform APIs, that they are async themselves.
Yeah, maybe sync then, fire and forget.
Yeah, I would just try and, I think it's either's fine. It's a little weird if the task could never fail, and then what are you waiting for? So I would just be consistent with anything that opens UI like this. And either, if it's truly fire forget and you're never going to get an error back to give to the user, then make it void. If you might get an error back, make it task returning and do that across the board.
So one scenario that you could have is, so on Windows, this is asynchronous, and the asynchronous operation returns a bool, which we don't expose to our users.
Right.
And it returns true if the URI was launched, right? Else it doesn't.
I mean, you could convert that into a failure if you wanted to. You could turn a bool into an exception if that was desirable.
That is correct, yeah.
Yeah, because void doesn't mean you can't throw.
It's true.
Yeah.
But if it was actually asynchronous, you wouldn't want to block waiting for the asynchronous operation to tell you that it failed.
Yeah. So right now it's basically it's not fire and forget, because we are, we would bubble up that, and I guess there would be no exception that would occur. It will return true or false. So in this instance, there is no exception that could occur on iOS or Android from my understanding, looking at my code today.
Yeah,
but there is
Windows can fail.
But Windows could fail, and that's why this is sort of the least common denominator.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
So we went under this assumption, and this was someone that from the community asked us, was, two of the platforms don't require async, but the third one technically has an asynchronous API that you have to call. So what we do for ours is that we say if one of them is asynchronous, we make everything asynchronous, right?
I think that's pretty
So
good
to your
policy.
point, that's what we do.
I think that's reasonable, especially for something like this. There are cases where that falls down, but
Like if a fourth platform decides to stand up in the future.
Yes.
well, what would the downside there be? What would that do that would be problematic?
Well, I'm saying right now, if it's everyone is everyone is synchronous.
If everyone is synchronous right now, yeah.
So you've gone with synchronous, and then it's like, well, this fourth one popped up, so now we wish we were
at
async.
that point, you introduce an asynchronous overload.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And then just out of curiosity, is there a regular handling between all of the OSs if you give an invalidly formed URI? Like TTP : foo?
The TTP : protocol.
I think we do detect for at least a valid like system.uri.
Well, I mean, like if
It's a valid URI.
fair enough. Like, yeah. So I guess I'm just wondering if that's why Windows is would report false if it's unknown.
So
protocol
it
or
also
whatever.
reports false if, for instance, you give it a file URI and the UNC share is unavailable. But that's a network operation, hence async.
What's the difference between external and system preferred?
Yeah, so system preferred is the default, and system preferred uses on iOS SF Safari View, which is an optimized browser that it's not in your app, but it's more attached to your app. So there's like a done button, and that done button will bring you back into your app.
Okay.
And on Android, it uses Chrome Custom Tab, so it feels more integrated. Where on external, it basically launches an intent system out. So on Android, it could launch a different browser, for instance. So it's kind of external to your application. On Windows, it's always just launches whatever your default is. We don't have control over that. But
If system preferred is your recommended default, it should be 0.
Yeah.
okay.
Launch mode equals default.
Yeah, so for instance, in the open async, if you don't pass it a browser launch mode, it will use system preferred.
Yeah, so like Jeremy said, that should be 0 then.
Yeah. I mean, if you called them default and external, you would assume the default and external were the same.
Yeah.
But-
Okay. Clipboard? Why is one of the clipboard APIs synchronous and the other async?
This is another scenario where in the world of clipboard, there is basically on Windows, get is asynchronous and set is not asynchronous.
That makes no sense.
The actual Windows API.
So you know if you have text because has text returns bool synchronously, but you don't know what the text is.
Well, I think it makes sense given
Maybe
the
it has to
Windows
page back
guidelines
in.
that they had, because they had this guideline that says an operation can take longer than 20 milliseconds or something.
Yeah.
It needs to be asynchronous. And I guess get text may have to convert formats and actually persist the text, versus set text will always be
what
very
could the
fast.
storage?
But yeah, I'm not saying it's a
What
great
could the storage
API.
possibly be then?
I mean, there is like cloud clipboard, but
Yeah, but then set would presumably be.
I mean, really, here, since we're all making fun of what Windows did here, maybe this one it should not be async and you should eat the state
yeah,
internally.
yeah.
I mean, that's more consistent with all guidelines because we
sorry,
did
you
not
mean
have.
get text async should not be async?
Then it should be get text, and if Windows it's async, they should.
I don't know. I mean, something like Cloud Clipboard is a good example.
Well, cloud clipboard just takes place in the background. Like your application isn't aware of the fact that it exists.
Right, but does that mean that getting and maybe setting could be?
No, getting it's just automatically synced by the OS in the background.
Oh, you're not doing IO.
You don't do anything.
Yes, just whatever's in the local buffer.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to go the opposite direction. I was going to go, if there's a reason that getting is async, maybe set text should also be async.
that's also fair.
At least it's easier conversion.
I don't know what the UWP app model actually looks like here, but is this... Windows likes the notion of having multiple clipboards on your clipboard. Do we know which clipboard or clipboards this is using?
Sure. So I posted in the chat window the actual code that we're calling, so you can take a look at it. So inside of this, we are...
One thing that's to do with the set text, which is a little bit different, is that it's not guaranteed to be complete when the method returns. So you could call set text, get text straight away, and it hasn't actually been set yet. It's sort of like operating system, set this text, and then sort of I'm leaving it up to you. So I noticed that I think it was either Android or UWP. I would set the text and get it straight away as part of my unit test, and it hadn't set yet, so I've got a delay for a couple of milliseconds. Let me see if I can find that.
All right.
Yeah, so Windows does have an async API to get the clipboard history.
History?
Yeah.
I have that.
I'm not sure who was just speaking, but that's a good argument for not making set text async, because if you did, you would assume that when it completed, it had completed. Then again, void returning, I would also assume it had completed. Yeah. So it just seems like a weird OS API.
Yeah, I think there's no good way to model that.
Yeah, like if UWP exposes like the file explorer and you copy a file, what does get text async do? These are questions that I have given that I've learned that clipboards are weird.
What is the failure mode of get text async? Like, what if there's no text? Does it just return null?
I'm just going to go into the source.
No.
Null or empty, I guess either one would work.
It returns a null currently.
It's reasonable.
So, do you only support text? Like, you don't have a notion of like arbitrary bytes or images or whatever? Like, you don't have that?
Not at this point. No.
Take your image, convert it to base 64, save the base 64 text.
That seems completely reasonable.
Yeah, technically each API does have text and images and maybe URLs. And
I was going to say, even how they handle images might be more like URL stream based than, here's an image.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have no idea what the mode is. On Windows, I know we have like 500 different flags for the clipboard, right? And I was just wondering what you probably don't have much consistency across the platform.
That's my reference to which clipboards.
Also, how we do it on UWP is they just have a generic clipboard, and it gets the current content that is stored in the clipboard object. That's what it is. So
you know the
namespace
where it's
in? Documentation. Yeah, as far as I can tell, that there's no way to specifically get like Cloud Clipboard from the Clipboard API.
Right.
Yeah. So Compass, is the low pass filter something that makes sense to be changing independent of the sensor speed? If yes, it's fine. And if no, maybe it's this parameter to start.
So yeah, that is one that technically you could change later on with the get set, correct? It actually only applies to Android, but we did put it in the shared code. So there's probably a consistency problem there.
Okay.
The Android Compass is very not great, so we apply this. It's a common thing that's on there, but I would say that most likely it would not be changed later. John?
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't imagine users wanting to not have it if they ever do need it, so maybe it does make sense to move into the start.
Yeah,
and
I think so.
Maybe as a default value so that people who don't know what it means don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would imagine more people probably want it than do not on Android.
Correct. Yeah. And that would be good to change now because that would be a change in functionality. So.
Yeah.
So Compass data, heading magnetic north. Is this magnetic degrees? Magnetic radians?
So heading, yeah. So Compass. I'll look at the documentation. There's great documentation for all of this. It is degrees 0 to 360.
Yeah, so I would
Or
go
0
with
to
magnetic
50.
degrees.
Yeah.
Heading magnetic north just feels weird, unless this is a Australian pride. They like returning orientation pointing to south or something, but the north to me feels implied from a compass.
So I would say that there's really two things that you could possibly provide, which is magnetic north and true north.
Yeah.
And obviously we're not going to do true north because we need the GPS location. That's not the idea of it.
I like magnetic being in the name. I just think that the north is redundant, and heading might also be redundant. So that's why I suggested magnetic degrees.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. So in this instance, we actually followed UWP specifically, which is actually called heading magnetic north. Funnily enough, iOS calls it magnetic heading. So we put those, but I do believe that probably magnetic makes the most sense, actually.
Quite frankly, just degrees also seems fine by me. Like, what else would it indicate than the heading towards north, right?
Right. I mean, so technically, if you're using a compass, it is usually implying that it is based on the magnetic heading.
Yeah.
But there is the difference between magnetic north and true north. And if you're trying to tell someone where they're going, there's a difference. And I know that at least Apple's Compass app does do the GPS integration and can tell you true versus magnetic. But that may be an app feature instead of a compass feature.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah. The only reason I would say that we kept it this way is just surely for the sake that it's the same name as what UWP says. So we often defaulted to that as somebody on that team must have thought of the name. That was our thought. So I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
Fair enough. All right, moving on.
So connection profile. Other, I would probably call unknown and give that one the 0 value. And then we get to ask the question about capital letters and WiMAX.
I was about to say, what is MAX? Is it an acronym? Is that
a brand name? Or a
trademark? Yeah. WiMAX is that is a trademark of WiMAX. It's a communication standard, so I don't think it's a trademark, but it's a standard, and that's just how it's spelled. Like the actual name itself, like a MAC address, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very interesting love-hate relationship with 3-letter capitals. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, it should be probably spelled like this. I mean, we do the same thing everywhere else, right? Like, the brand is called .NET, and when we spell it out, it's usually like this.
Yes, but then it's NetCore is capital NET, capital C. So.
You know, SHA should really be this one, except that we fucked that one up.
Well, sometimes it's capital and sometimes it's lowercase.
Yeah,
it
so that goes back to we fucked it up. But I think that, I mean, the rules are very simple. If it's a 2-letter acronym, it's caps. Thank you. And if it's 3 or more, then it's Pascal cased, unless the word is ID, in which case we treat it as a word, so it's lowercase d.
Yeah.
So it's pretty simple once you get the hang of it.
So from the extension model, I would rename other to unknown, and I would give it 0, so that as more connection profile types come on in the future, you don't have other being in the middle.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
And then if connection profile is ever used as an input on something, if it would ever be, then the 0 value being the other/unknown is a clear, like, I don't know what you want me to do, instead of, oh, we defaulted to Bluetooth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, make sure you call it unknown. So.
Yeah. All right. Connectivity, network access. Network access is an enum, I suppose, which probably comes way down.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this really quick. Network access. Constrained internet, local, non-unknown.
It's constrained internet, like behind a.
It's in China.
Oh, no, I'm like behind a, like a.
I think like meter.
Well, is that the when you get like the Wi-Fi antenna with a bang through it of I don't think I can reach the internet, but I have an IP address?
Captive portal, that's what I'm looking for. Is it a captive portal?
Yeah, so constrained internet is limited internet access, often behind a captive portal connectivity where we can detect it.
Yeah, but I ask for something on the internet, it doesn't seem to be working, but I have an IP address, so I don't know what's up. Internet? Yeah.
Correct, yeah, exactly, yeah. So this means that you may be local and have local access to a web portal, but that's it.
Yeah.
And these were copied basically one-to-one from UWP, so.
What do you return for profiles?
Yeah, so for profiles, we return.
Is it so? No, I mean like the actual instance. Is it an array?
Is the actual instance.
Or a yield return?
Why do you want to know?
Because people always don't count, and then you're screwed the next time you change it.
We usually yield return.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yep.
That's good.
Yeah. If you have an internal type or a yield, which is basically the same thing, then you're good.
Because
Yeah, we yield return.
P.
Remember array.empty or enumerable.empty? And we changed it to an array and everything broke, or we moved away from an array, everything broke.
Yeah. So I assume that the reason it's enumerable is because if you're connected to Wi-Fi and cellular, you'll get both of those back. And then just as a implementation, make sure that you handle being in the middle of enumerating and they turn off Wi-Fi.
Yeah, correct. So we gather all the all profiles first and then enumerate over them.
Okay.
So it's a snapshot in time from when you called it.
Okay.
All right. What in the changed event arcs? What does profiles represent? The ones that are now available, or the ones that have changed?
This is the current state. So it is the current state. So it'd be the same as if you called profile. So
Right.
when it changed, it is the current new ones.
So
Not a diff.
maybe both of those should be current profiles?
Or available profiles or something? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow. If I get an event and then I wait 10 minutes and then I read profiles from the event args, am I seeing the state of things from 10 minutes ago or from now?
You
You
wait 10 minutes before reading the event args, or you wait 10 minutes before reading the connectivity?
I wait
profiles?
10 minutes before reading event args.profiles.
I think that snapshotted.
That's from 10 minutes.
Snapshotted.
Okay, good.
Yeah, correct. We copy over the values.
Cool. If you said current, I was going to say we should just get rid of that property. But
Well, so that's why I don't think it's really current, because current would be confusing.
Right.
Because it's not the current, it is
Okay.
the profiles of that event change.
right, yeah, I think this
Fair,
is fine.
yeah, fair enough. The
Yeah, if anything, it would be
active?
like current.
well, I mean, yeah, I guess any word that we put, there's always the question of as of when you read it or as of when it was
I
there.
think profiles is fine.
And the reason we don't put active, and I'll tell you specifically, is because let's say it returns Wi-Fi and cellular. That means most likely that the actual active one is going to be Wi-Fi and not cellular, but they are technically both there. So
Right.
the system
Right.
could determine based on different demands what to use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just making sure that it feels clear to you and your average consumer that this means things that have IP addresses and not things that could have IP addresses, like when Wi-Fi is in searching mode. And it probably doesn't super matter, but I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
All right, data transfer makes no sense to me.
So I hate the name data transfer, and it came from Windows. I used to call this share. So the idea is that this is when I like hit a share button and I'm going to share text to another application. So, you know, I go to tweet something, right? So you make a share request, and normally that's text or images or something else. So you're literally sharing or transferring data, if you will, between one application to another. We went with data transfer just because that's the UWP name. I don't know if share is correct. Share also seems a little bit weird of a name.
What do Apple and Google call them?
Yeah, so Google doesn't have so Android
It's like an intent.
It's an intent. So yeah, iOS is called a share activity. So you open a share activity.
I would say, I mean, my personal opinion is, and maybe that's not the most informed one, but I would go with something people are likely to look for. Like, I think sharing should probably be in the name somehow, because if it's sharing, I mean, like, that's basically how the UI refers to it across all platforms, even on Android, I believe it's called sharing, if you actually do that as a user, which is probably better than whatever the underlying platform calls it API-wise.
Yeah, or...
Because data transfer, like, I mean, Windows does the same thing with the clipboard. It's under the data transfer namespace. It's brilliant. Like, I don't think anybody ever uses those as the searching
this will,
keywords.
You know, frame things from my head, but the button that you use to send things to other applications in Safari, in ForeFlight, they use that same icon and call it send to. So maybe that makes more sense, but I don't know if the universe agrees on what the box with an arrow leading out of it means. So, export thingy. Do not use thingy.
No, let's go with thingy.
All right.
Xamarin Essentials thingy.
Thingy.submit. I love it.
Ship it.
I think, I don't know, data transfer sharing, whatever. It's...
Yeah, I mean...
I think sharing is better, probably, if I was to go back in time.
If you call it sharing, and people know what it's for. If it's data transfer, like, I'm not sure what it's done.
Yeah, because to me that sounds like network play.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
then I'm surprised that there's no answer, or that I can't... in this case, it's weird, because a data transfer request, well, that sounds like I want to download, but you're not giving me the download. And so that was actually my first impression, was that data transfer is download or upload. And...
All right.
Yeah, so obviously the difference between app info and device info is that this is the actual device that you're on. So.
Mm-hmm. No, device type would be next.
Yeah, so device display, you're assuming there's only a single device, single display, right?
Single device. Yeah, I mean, you can't have multiple devices.
No, I meant like this one here, right? Device display.
Device display.
Screen metrics is probably the I would assume the. Yeah, you basically have one of them, right?
Well, ish. I assume that they have that because it has an event, because you can do that, and now you get the event that you rotated sideways. Width and height have changed.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also on, I know like Win 8 had this do side-by-side split. Maybe Apple, where they keep rewriting what tablets do and annoy me. Maybe they're going to invent that one day.
Yeah, like the reason I'm asking is because I can totally see a world where you can connect your iPhone or whatever to an external projector, right? And the question is like, you have technically probably two of them, right?
And what does does one of these fire on the iPhones that are too big, where you tell it fit my thumb? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so this is the device. It's not your application's dimensions. Okay. It is the device dimensions. So for Windows, for instance, we get the current view, so the current physical view that you're on, whatever Windows decides, I guess, at that point of view. So it's the screen width and the height of the monitor. On iOS, it is going to be the bounds of the main screen. So whatever Apple signifies as that. So on a iPhone, let's say Plus, it will still be that. And basically the size will most likely never change because it's impossible for it to change. But it could rotate, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Fair.
Yeah.
So looking down, unsupported for idioms and platforms both feel more like you probably need unknown. And I'm amused that this is a place where you can use name of. And then, and now we have a branding question on iOS and UWP's capitalization.
The problem is that's a fight you can't win, because they changed their mind, right? Like macOS used to be capital M, now it's lowercase m. It's like, wow.
Right. Well, I just mean like iOS. Do we keep the little I?
Yeah, I mean that's my point, right? Like it's if you align with brands, they may change.
Right.
If you don't, then well, you don't. You're at least.
But technically, our casing rules say that UWP should be up.
Right.
Or that we call the constant universal Windows platform, and then it returns the string UWP.
Honestly,
but I don't care a lot. I'm just
yeah. I mean,
I'm letting us say that we
platforms
don't care.
capital I lowercase OS would look really strange to me.
Yep.
Yeah, it looks terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't make you think like of what it is immediately. Like you see this capitalization, you're like, oh, I know what that is.
Yeah.
All right, it's been discussed. But yeah, so again, unsupported. I feel like what you're probably reporting if you're returning unsupported is that you didn't know how to map it, which
Right.
sounds more like unknown than unsupported.
Got it.
Which is just me thinking.
So, James, like, isn't like I don't know how Apple models that, but do they really say that like what do they do for the watch? Isn't that a entry under idioms as well?
Yeah, so that's a good, and even the chat, Damien was asking about this. So technically on Android, you can kind of run an Android app on anything. So by default, on Android, we support every single Android device. On iOS, TV and watchOS are completely different platforms, which Xamarin Essentials does not support. So it would actually say unsupported in that instance because we don't know what it is. I mean, I guess it would actually throw an exception, to be honest with you, because you'd be on an unsupported platform. But I do think that watch should be added here because technically on Android it could be a watch, and that is a supported platform. So on iOS and Android, like on iOS, it's not iOS, right? Technically, it would be a new platform. So here's where it becomes interesting. So if you think about this, is there's idioms and platforms. So technically, there's Wear OS, which is Android's Wear OS, but the underlying platform is just Android, right?
Right.
But for iOS, it's not iOS on tvOS, it's tvOS and watchOS. So they're completely different operating systems that are there, right? And you could run a UWP application on an Xbox. So the idiom would be Xbox, I guess, or TV at that point. It'd still be a UWP app. So I think that's how we look at it, is like at the end of the day, what the user is compiling the application into is the platform. So I'm compiling a Android Wear OS app into a Android application. There's no differential, like from our platform, where idioms are, where is that application running? So they're kind of duplicate in a way, but also not really.
So what kind of code do people write that uses the idioms? Is it literally just something you put in a log file, or is that something that you actually write code for that says if I'm on desktop,
I think it's more for like tablet versus phone in a lot of cases for iOS and Android, where they might want to make a decision on how to navigate or display a different UI. There's certainly other ways of doing that, but I think that does get used at some points.
You mentioned Xbox and guessing that it would go to TV. Like, if I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, maybe this tells me what sort of events I should be expecting. Expecting things from an Xbox controller and a remote control feels slightly different. Like, I don't know if the smart TVs would be a UWP thing or some other OS completely, but that's. I just got to thinking of Xbox as sort of TV and sort of not. So.
Yeah, I think we sort of think of what the display is. So what is the display that you're running on form factor wise? Yeah. So for an Android TV application, it's running on my NVIDIA Shield, but it's running on the TV. And that NVIDIA Shield does have a game remote. So it is a tricky situation in that instance. So I think we think of Idiom as the physical display that the user is looking at.
Yeah, it's like kind of the
a Nintendo Switch is a very complicated one because it can go into multiple.
Yeah. I think that makes sense because you're kind of often making UI decisions based on this in a lot of ways. So Xbox generally is going to be 10 feet away or whatever.
Would this be display idiom maybe?
Well, it's also about.
I guess if you document what idiom means, then it's fine. But
yeah, so this is an interesting case because this idiom, as you can see, is a static class that's inside of device information. So it's literally locked into that one, unlike other ones.
Mm-hmm. Right, but
so.
But again, you said that you're thinking of the idiom as sort of the display factor, and I was thinking of it as an input factor, and so clarifying what you mean from idiom either by documentation or by making the name be self-documenting seems good. And then, so are you doing the consts for comparison or because these are input values to something?
Matthew?
There were two reasons, I think, for that decision. First one was existing things like Xamarin Forms and stuff was like, oh, what do we use for UWP iOS? Well, that's what we wrote at the time. And for example, TV was capitalized for whatever reason on one platform. So when we do Essentials, we want to be able people to compare, like, oh, Xamarin, we do Xamarin Forms.platform, and then we're going to do an actual string equals just because someone might do that. And then the other one was, I think for extensibility, because if we had an enum, it might break, or if we had like things like that, let's say like, okay, let's say we can add ties and support or something like that, then that, all we have to do is like the next version of the library will just have a new platform, or in case of the watch, we just add it, and then the property device info.platform, it is just a string, and if some custom user, let's just say, the Bing team comes out with a new Bing device, then the platform would be Bing device, and they don't have to add a new item to an enum or something. They can just return their custom string.
Totally.
So we have a pattern that we've used a bit called strongly typed string, which is you have a struct that only has one member, which is a string, and then the struct looks like an enum to most people, but it's actually just a accelerator for wrapping a bunch of constant strings. So if you look at the hash algorithm name type, that's an example of this. It uses strings for extensibility reasons, but it looks like an enum for programmability reasons.
Yeah, or the one I linked here, which is OS platform.
Yeah,
same concept.
So
like the benefit of this is if you have a property that returns a string, well, it now returns whatever the type is, right? So like it's strongly typed in the sense that people discover that there is basically an enum behind that.
Yeah.
But you don't lose the accessibility, as you said, right? You just ask the OS, you get a string, you put it into the enum, and then nothing bad happens in V2.
So consider a strongly typed string, and then I don't remember which way we feel about nested types.
Yeah, nested types are both good and bad. I mean, what they do is they make the type less discoverable. If that's what you want, it's good. If that's not what you want, then that's bad, right? So I would generally suggest that if you make these strongly typed strings, I think having them as nested types is fine because people will see them in the signature. But in your case, the problem is you just return them as strings. People kind of have to know there's a nested type in idioms that they can basically go over. But like that is effectively, that like I don't know how you would discover that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Also, how do you even? Oh, because it's idioms. I guess that's why it works. Yeah, because I'm like their names seem to conflict, but no, they don't. I guess the plural and singular with the property kind of ties them together in IntelliSense. That might be actually good enough as a discoverability mechanism when I'm thinking about it. But yeah.
But it does, if you read both of them and you're passing them to a function, the strongly typed version reminds you which one's which.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think it's generally a better way to do it. It doesn't cost you much. All right, we are now basically over time, so we can, oh, no, over time, but we have like 2 minutes left. So I think the question that I have is, so we, look at the scroll bar here, we went through what, a third maybe? We can do one of two things. We can either like set up another one and just complete it. But I think most of the value that you're getting out of the review, you kind of already gotten. Because I think the other people will be very similar.
Yep.
So I would suggest, I will send you the notes. The most useful ones might be the more high-level discussion that we had in the beginning of like capability APIs and how to deal with static state and the events. And then I think, you got a bunch of feedback here on the actual API shape, and you just apply for the rest of the library, and then maybe send us the end result.
Could you also send out this so we could skim the rest?
Yeah, so I will basically do the same thing I did last week. I would just upload the whole thing to our API review repo that will have the entire API surface plus these comments here.
Cool.
And then we can do it offline if we want to.
Oh, cool.
Does that make sense? You guys are planning on shipping in, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or something like that?
We
don't have a firm date.
No public firm date.
Okay. So then...
I'm at the best.
I like that. I'm only asking because it kind of controls like how fast we should be on our end.
Yes.
All right.
I can talk offline about our plans.
Good. Sounds good. Then, all right. Do you guys any more questions? Nope. All right.
So.
Then.
This is really cool, guys. Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah.
Thanks for your help. This has been great.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.